My name is Lena. I'm in my early 30s. And for most of my life, I've been the kind of person people describe with words that sound harmless, easygoing, reliable, low maintenance. The kind of woman who shows up on time, remembers birthdays, helps clean up after everyone else has gone home, and doesn't ask for much in return. I've learned that when you're quiet, people don't see silence as a personality trait. They see it as permission. I work in a role that requires precision and patience. It's not glamorous, and it's rarely visible. If everything goes right, no one notices. If something goes wrong, suddenly everyone has questions. That pattern didn't just exist in my work life. It existed in my family too. From the outside, I probably looked like the reasonable one, the one who didn't need attention, the one who would understand. And because I rarely raised my voice or demanded space, people assumed I didn't need either. This story isn't about anger. It isn't about revenge. And it isn't about finally yelling back. It's about what happens when silence is mistaken for weakness, and how truth, spoken once and calmly, can change an entire room. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of how my parents publicly humiliated me during my sister's wedding reception, and how I responded in a way no one expected, not with chaos, not with tears, but with clarity. I won't dramatize this. I won't exaggerate details to make anyone look like a villain. Real life is quieter than that, more uncomfortable, more subtle. The harm didn't come from one explosive moment. It came from patterns that were normalized over years until a single evening made it impossible for me to pretend anymore. You'll hear about the role I was assigned without ever agreeing to it. You'll hear about the small dismissals that everyone else laughed off. You'll hear about the moment I realized that staying quiet was no longer protecting peace. It was protecting a lie. And most importantly, you'll hear about what changed after I spoke. Not dramatically, not instantly, but permanently. I'm sharing this story because many of us were taught that being calm means being compliant, that being the good one means absorbing discomfort so others don't have to feel it. We were praised for our restraint without realizing the cost. This isn't a story about winning. It's a story about reclaiming authorship over your own narrative. If you've ever been the person people underestimate, if you've ever been praised for being quiet when what they really meant was convenient, or if you've ever wondered whether speaking the truth would destroy the room or finally set it right, then this story is for you. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was never meant to include you? To my parents, I was the easy child, not the impressive one, not the difficult one, not the one who demanded conversations or caused worry. I was the one they never had to explain to other people, the one who adapted, the one who understood how things were. Growing up, that role was praised constantly, but only in hindsight did I realize what it really meant. Being easy meant being flexible. Being flexible meant bending, and bending, over time, becomes a shape you no longer recognize as your own. My younger sister was always described in brighter language. She was spirited, emotional, expressive. If she was upset, it was because she felt deeply. If she wanted something, it was because she knew her worth. Her needs were treated like weather, unpredictable, sometimes inconvenient, but always worthy of preparation. I was treated like infrastructure, reliable background, expected to hold. At family gatherings, people asked me practical questions. Who was bringing what? Whether I could help set up. If I didn't mind watching coats, or keeping an eye on timing, or making sure our parents didn't forget something important. No one asked me how I was doing unless there was a pause that needed filling. And I didn't push back. Not because I was afraid, but because I was taught that harmony mattered more than articulation. That if no one was upset, everything must be fine. I learned early how to disappear without leaving. I smiled at jokes that landed too close to home. I nodded through comparisons framed as compliments. "You're so independent," my mother would say, which really meant, "You don't require much from us." "You're not sensitive like your sister," my father would add, as if sensitivity were a flaw instead of a signal. Over time, I internalized the idea that my value was tied to how little space I occupied. In photos, I stood slightly behind. At dinners, I waited to speak. When plans changed without consulting me, I adjusted quietly. It wasn't martyrdom. It was conditioning. I had learned that if I made things easier for everyone else, I would be loved consistently. What no one noticed was how much effort it took to remain that version of myself. By adulthood, the dynamic had solidified. I was the one who booked flights for group trips, the one who handled logistics, the one who could be relied on to stay calm when tensions rose, because tensions rarely centered on me. I wasn't the axis of conflict. I was the buffer. And buffers aren't supposed to speak. They're supposed to absorb. When my sister got engaged, the family narrative intensified. This was her moment. Everyone rallied, opinions were loud, emotions were high, decisions were urgent. I was folded naturally into the background of preparation, as if my presence were assumed rather than chosen. No one asked if I wanted a role. I was simply assigned one, and I accepted it, because that's who I had been to them for as long as I could remember. The thing about being underestimated is that it doesn't feel like an insult at first. It feels like peace, like safety, like you're doing something right. It's only later, when a boundary is crossed so casually, so publicly, that you realize people weren't being gentle with you. They just didn't think you mattered enough to be careful. At the time, I still believed that if I stayed composed, everything would resolve itself. That dignity meant endurance. That silence meant maturity. I hadn't yet understood that silence, repeated long enough, becomes a story other people tell about you. And once that story hardens, they feel entitled to act it out, no matter who's watching. The first moment that stayed with me didn't arrive loudly. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic pause that made everyone turn their heads. That's why it was so easy for everyone else to forget it ever happened. It was during one of the early wedding planning dinners, not even the reception night. Just a gathering at my parents' house, the kind where plates don't quite match and conversations overlap. My sister and her fiancé were seated at the center of the table naturally. Everyone leaned toward them, toward the story that was forming around their future. I had arrived early as usual, helped set the table, refreshed drinks, listened more than I spoke. At some point, the conversation turned to speeches. My mother mentioned how emotional my sister would be, how touching her words would be, and how everyone should prepare tissues. There was laughter, warmth, anticipation. Then my father smiled, casually, almost fondly, and said, "Well, at least we don't have to worry about Lena making it awkward. She doesn't really do speeches." He chuckled. Someone else nodded. The moment passed. I smiled too, automatically. On the surface, it sounded harmless, even accurate. I wasn't known for speeches. I didn't command rooms. But there was something about the way it was said, final, dismissive, conclusive, that made my chest tighten just a little. Not because I wanted to give a speech, but because no one had thought to ask. The assumption had already been made. Not just that I wouldn't speak, but that my voice wouldn't add anything if I did. No one noticed my pause. No one noticed that I went quiet after that. Not in my usual listening way, but in a withdrawing way. The conversation flowed on, buoyant and busy, and I let it carry me past my own reaction. Later that night, as I washed dishes beside my mother, I almost said something. The words hovered, simple, non-confrontational. That comment earlier made me feel small, or even, I might have wanted to say something. But she looked tired, happy, preoccupied, so I let it go. That was the first cut. Small enough to dismiss, clean enough to rationalize, invisible enough that if I brought it up later, I knew exactly how it would be framed. "You're reading too much into it. He didn't mean it like that." "Why are you so sensitive all of a sudden?" So I absorbed it, like I always had. In the weeks that followed, there were other moments, equally subtle. Decisions are announced instead of discussed. Tasks delegated without acknowledgement. Jokes that landed softly on me because no one expected me to react. "You're so low maintenance," someone said once, as if it were a compliment. "You don't mind," someone else added, already moving on. Each time I felt the same brief sting, and each time I told myself it wasn't worth disrupting the mood. Those weddings were stressful, that this wasn't about me. What I didn't realize then was how important that first moment had been, not for what was said, but for what it signaled. It showed me how easily my absence could be assumed, even while I was sitting right there. How naturally people spoke about me instead of to me. How my silence had been folded into their expectations so completely that it no longer registered as a choice. Everyone else forgot that dinner. If I brought it up now, They wouldn't remember the comment, only my reaction to it. But I remembered, because that was the moment I first understood something uncomfortable. They weren't trying to hurt me. They simply weren't considering me. And that realization cuts differently. It doesn't burn, it doesn't bruise, it settles. Quietly. And once it settles, you start to see how often it's been happening. Once you accept a small dismissal without naming it, something subtle shifts. Not in the people around you, but in the rules they believe apply to you. After that dinner, nothing dramatic changed. No one suddenly became cruel. In fact, if you asked my family during that time, they would have said everything was fine. Happy even. Wedding planning was moving forward. Group chats were active, schedules were filling up. And yet, the pattern deepened. It showed up in how decisions were communicated. Not discussed, announced. A message would appear in the family chat with finalized plans, and my role would already be assigned. Pickups, drop-offs, follow-ups, tasks that required time, attention, and emotional labor, but no recognition. If I responded with a simple "got it," the conversation moved on. If I asked a question, there was often a pause, then reassurance. "Don't worry about it, we've got it handled," which usually meant we've decided without you. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Stress makes people clumsy. Weddings bring out impatience. No one is at their best. I didn't want to be the person who complicated an already emotional process. So I adapted. I answered quickly. I stayed flexible. I absorbed last-minute changes without comment. I became even more efficient, as if excellence could compensate for invisibility. And the more I did that, the more invisible I became. There's a specific kind of disrespect that doesn't look like hostility. It looks like comfort, familiarity, assumption. It's when people feel so secure in your compliance that they stop checking whether you're okay with what they're taking. My parents had always framed my calm as resilience, as a strength. And maybe it was once. But now it had become a justification. "You're the stable one," my mother said when I gently questioned a decision that affected my schedule. "You don't get upset over little things," my father added, smiling, as if that settled it. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not the decisions themselves, but the way my emotional range had been quietly erased. As if I were immune to impact. As if consideration was something I had opted out of by being composed. There were moments when I almost broke the pattern. A sentence would rise in my chest, fully formed. "I would have liked to be included. That comment didn't feel fair." I don't want to do that. But each time I pictured the reaction. Confusion, mild annoyance, the subtle shift in atmosphere. I imagined being told I was making things harder than they needed to be. So I swallowed the words. And then I told myself a story, a very convincing one. I told myself that being quiet was a choice, that I was above needing validation, that my sense of self didn't depend on how much space others gave me. I told myself I was protecting the bigger picture. What I didn't admit was that part of me was afraid, not of conflict, but of discovering that if I spoke, nothing would change, that my feelings would be acknowledged politely and then set aside, that I would be revealed, unmistakably, as optional. It's easier to normalize disrespect when it arrives dressed as efficiency, when no one raises their voice, when the people involved genuinely believe they're being reasonable. That's how it becomes a habit. That's how it embeds itself into family culture. That's how silence turns into expectation. By the time the wedding week approached, I had been conditioned into a role so thoroughly that stepping outside of it felt almost inappropriate, as if asserting myself would be a betrayal of who I was supposed to be. I didn't see myself as mistreated. I saw myself as useful. And that distinction mattered, because as long as I framed it that way, I could keep going. I could keep helping, keep adjusting, keep quiet, until the cost of that quiet became impossible to ignore. Because there's a limit to how much you can rationalize before your body starts telling the truth for you, before the pauses grow heavier, before the smiles take effort, before you realize that staying silent isn't neutral anymore. It's an endorsement. I didn't realize I'd been cast until I noticed how uncomfortable everyone became whenever I stepped even slightly off script. The role was never discussed. No one sat me down and explained it. It emerged quietly, the way these things always do, through repetition, assumption, and relief. Relief that someone else would handle what needed handling. Relief that someone else wouldn't push back. I was the reliable one, the capable one, the one who could be counted on to smooth things over without being asked. In theory, it sounded flattering. In practice, it meant I was expected to absorb inconvenience without reaction. As the wedding approached, the expectation sharpened. I was looped into logistics but not into decisions. I was asked to confirm arrangements I hadn't been consulted on. When I hesitated, even briefly, the response was immediate reassurance, delivered with a tone that suggested I was being gently unreasonable. "You're okay with this, right?" It wasn't really a question, because the real answer had already been assumed. I began to notice how differently the room responded to my sister. If she expressed frustration, it was addressed. If she needed a change, people adjusted. Her emotions were treated like data, important inputs to be factored in. Mine were treated like static. If I showed fatigue, it was met with gratitude, not concern. "If you're tired, you don't have to help," someone would say, while continuing to rely on me anyway. If I expressed uncertainty, it was reframed as hesitation I'd work through on my own. I wasn't asked what I wanted. I was asked what I could do, and I did it, because I had been doing it for years. What made it harder to name was that no one was overtly cruel. There were smiles, thank yous, occasional praise, usually delivered after the fact when the work was already done. But praise that arrives only after compliance isn't appreciation, it's reinforcement. It trains you to associate worth with output, to believe that if you stop performing, you stop mattering. I remember one moment clearly. I had suggested a small adjustment to the reception schedule. Nothing dramatic, just a practical consideration based on timing. The room went quiet for a second, then my father waved it off lightly. "We'll figure it out. Lena's good at adapting." He meant it kindly. I know that now. But the implication landed hard. Your adaptability is more valuable than your input. That was the role. Not the planner, not the voice of reason, not even the support. I was the contingency plan. The person you rely on because you don't have to check in with them, because they won't object, because they'll make it work. And once you realize that's how people see you, you also realize how dangerous it is to stay there, because contingency plans don't get consulted. They get activated. I started to understand that the version of me my family was comfortable with required my silence, required my flexibility, required my willingness to disappear just enough to keep things moving. And the moment I stopped doing that, even briefly, I felt the tension rise. Not anger, not confrontation, discomfort, as if I were breaking an unspoken agreement. That was when it became clear to me. This wasn't about one wedding, or one comment, or one evening. It was about a dynamic that had been rehearsed for years, now reaching its most public stage, and I was being asked, quietly, politely, to play my part. At the time, I still believed I could manage it, that I could step into the role one last time and then step out afterward. Enduring this moment was the price of long-term peace. I hadn't yet understood that every role you accept teaches people how to treat you next, and that once a role is set, the room resists change, especially when the change comes from the person who's benefited everyone by staying quiet. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't come with a raised voice or a breaking point that everyone could point to later and say, "That's when it all changed." It happened in a moment so ordinary that no one but me noticed it. It was the morning of the rehearsal dinner. I was standing in the hotel bathroom, adjusting a dress I hadn't chosen, checking details I had been asked to just keep an eye on. The mirror reflected someone who looked composed, a calm face, steady hands, neutral posture, but something felt off. Not emotionally, physically. There was a tightness in my chest that hadn't been there before. Not panic, not sadness, just pressure. As if my body had been holding something in for too long and had finally decided it was done cooperating. I remember looking at myself and thinking, very clearly, if I keep doing this, I will lose something I won't get back. That thought didn't scare me, it clarified me. For the first time, I didn't ask whether my discomfort was justified. I didn't try to explain it away. I didn't weigh it against everyone else's needs. I simply acknowledged it. Throughout the day, I noticed how often I had been scanning rooms, not for enjoyment, but for responsibility. Tracking timing, anticipating issues, making sure others were comfortable before checking in with myself. It wasn't a skill, it was a reflex. At one point, my sister pulled me aside, not unkindly, just quickly, and asked me to handle a last-minute change. I agreed automatically, then paused. Something inside me said, "You don't have to respond like that anymore." So I didn't rush. I didn't apologize. I just said, I'll let you know. She blinked, not upset, just surprised. And that was it. That was the moment. I hadn't refused. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't even asserted a boundary out loud. I had simply interrupted the pattern. The rest of the day unfolded the same way it would have regardless. People moved, plans adjusted, laughter happened. No one noticed the internal shift because nothing external had changed. But for me, everything had. I realized that silence didn't have to be passive, that choosing not to explain myself didn't mean I was agreeing, that I could observe without absorbing. I stopped offering solutions before they were requested. I stopped filling pauses. I stopped smoothing edges that weren't mine to manage. And in that space, small, quiet, internal, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Agency, not power over anyone else, power over my own participation. That night, lying in bed, I didn't replay conversations the way I usually did. I didn't analyze tone or word choice or whether I had said too much or too little. I slept. The next day, the wedding day, I moved through the hours differently. Still helpful, still composed, but no longer overextended, no longer scanning for approval. And something interesting happened. People began to adjust, not consciously, not dramatically, but subtly. Someone else stepped in when a task wasn't immediately handled. A question was redirected. A pause was allowed to exist. The world didn't collapse because I didn't catch every loose end. That realization stayed with me. The shift wasn't about confrontation, it was about consent. I began to see how often I had been consenting automatically to roles, to expectations, to treatment, without ever checking whether I actually agreed. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. By the time the reception approached, I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I wasn't rehearsing responses. I wasn't preparing to endure. I was present. And presence, I learned, changes the rules. Because when you're no longer operating on reflex, silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes a choice. Once silence stopped being automatic, it started to feel different in my body. It was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I allowed or withheld. At the reception, I noticed how quickly people filled the space when I didn't. A question would hang in the air a second longer than usual. A decision would stall. Someone else would step forward to manage what I used to handle without thinking. No one commented on it, but I could feel the recalibration happening in real time. For years, my quiet had functioned like a safety net. People leaned on it without looking down. They assumed it would always be there, and now that it wasn't stretched as tightly, they had to adjust their footing. What surprised me wasn't their reaction. It was mine. I wasn't anxious, I wasn't guilty, I wasn't bracing for backlash. I felt steady, observant, as if I had stepped slightly out of frame and was finally watching the scene instead of carrying it. My parents moved through the reception with practiced ease, greeting guests, making small jokes, playing their roles as hosts. And for the first time, I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. They relied on my silence, not maliciously, not consciously, but thoroughly. It allowed them to speak freely, sometimes too freely, about family dynamics they assumed were settled. It allowed them to frame narratives without challenge. It allowed them to make remarks that sounded affectionate on the surface, but carried an edge when you listen closely. And I listened. There was a moment when my father made a comment at our table, light, joking, delivered to a group of extended relatives. It was about how I had always been the easy one, how I never caused stress the way others did. People laughed softly, nodded. I didn't. I didn't correct him. I didn't smile. I didn't rush to smooth the moment. I simply stayed still. The laughter faded faster than it should have. Someone changed the subject. The moment passed, but not unnoticed. That was when I understood something critical. My silence had been doing more work than my words ever could. For years, it had protected other people from having to reflect, from having to adjust, from having to sit with discomfort. And now that it was no longer cushioning those moments, the room felt it. Silence, when chosen, creates pressure. Not the explosive kind, the quiet kind. The kind that asks questions without voicing them. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't withholding affection. I was simply no longer translating myself into something easier for others to consume. And they didn't know what to do with that yet. Throughout the evening, I watched my parents glance at me more often than usual. Brief looks, curious looks, not angry. uncertain, as if they were checking for something familiar and not quite finding it. They mistook my calm for distance. They mistook my restraint for detachment. What they didn't realize was that this was the most present I had ever been. I was noticing details I had always filtered out before. Tone shifts, assumptions embedded in jokes. The way certain stories were told differed depending on who was listening. And slowly, I began to see the outline of something larger. A pattern that extended beyond this one event, beyond this one family role. Silence had protected them, protected their version of events, protected their comfort, protected the idea that everything was fine. But silence had also protected me from clarity. And now that clarity had arrived, I knew something had changed permanently. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was seeing. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't preparing a speech. I was gathering information. Because once silence becomes intentional, it stops being empty. It becomes strategic. There's an advantage to being underestimated for a long time. People stop monitoring you. They don't notice when you become more observant. They don't question when you start remembering details more precisely. They assume your quiet means disengagement, not analysis. That assumption gave me space. After the reception, life returned to something resembling normal. The wedding was over. The heightened emotions settled. Conversations became less frequent, more routine. To everyone else, the story had reached its happy conclusion. For me, something else had begun. I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, but structurally. I noticed how often family narratives were shaped by omission, how certain facts were smoothed over, how responsibility was redistributed after the fact to make outcomes feel inevitable rather than chosen. None of it was dramatic. That's what made it powerful. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand explanations. I simply listened, and when something didn't align, I wrote it down. I've always kept a notebook. It started as a practical habit, lists, reminders, schedules. Over time, it became something else, a record, not of grievances, but of patterns, dates, phrases, decisions, who said what and who benefited. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for coherence, and slowly it emerged. I noticed how often my parents spoke on my behalf, especially when explaining family dynamics to others, how my silence was interpreted as agreement, how my adaptability was used as evidence that certain choices had been fair. I noticed discrepancies between private conversations and public narratives. Small ones, plausible ones, the kind that, taken alone, could be dismissed, but together they formed a shape. What struck me most was how confident they were in that shape. They didn't think they were misrepresenting anything. They believed the story they were telling, because it had gone unchallenged for so long. And that's the thing about silence. It doesn't just hide conflict, it validates interpretation. I began organizing my thoughts the way I organize projects at work. What were the assumptions? What were the outcomes? Where did responsibility actually lie? I wasn't emotional about it. I wasn't angry. I felt focused. There were moments when I realized that certain decisions attributed to family consensus had never included me. That certain expectations placed on me had been framed as mutual understanding, when in reality they had been unilateral. I also noticed how often my contributions were referenced only when convenient, how my presence was assumed in planning, but optional in acknowledgement. This wasn't new information. What was new was that I wasn't excusing it anymore. I stopped filling in gaps in conversations. I let inaccuracies sit. I didn't correct them, not yet. I wanted to see how often they would stand unchallenged. They stood easily, because no one was used to me speaking up. And in that silence, I learned something important. The room had adjusted to my absence more comfortably than to my presence. That hurt briefly, but it also clarified something essential. If my presence wasn't required to maintain the narrative, then my silence had never been about harmony. It had been about convenience. Once I understood that, I also understood that any future conversation would need to be precise. Not emotional, not reactive. Truth delivered carelessly can be dismissed. Truth delivered calmly and completely changes dynamics. I began preparing, not for confrontation, but for alignment. I gathered documentation, not in a legal sense, but in a factual one. Messages, timelines, statements made at different times. I wasn't planning to expose anyone. I was planning to stop being misrepresented. And the more I prepared, the clearer something else became. I wasn't the only one who had benefited from my silence, but I was the only one who had paid for it. By the time I finished organizing what I knew, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not resentment. Readiness. Because once you see the full picture, you realize that speaking isn't about volume. It's about timing. The realization didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory. It arrived quietly, late one evening, as I sat alone with my notebook open in front of me. I had been reviewing patterns, not just what had happened around the wedding, but what had happened before it. Years of moments that had felt isolated at the time now lined up with unsettling clarity. Conversations that had seemed casual. Decisions that had been framed as unavoidable. Roles that had been described as natural. They weren't natural. They were convenient. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a secret in the dramatic sense. It was about recognizing leverage I already had. Leverage that came from consistency, reliability, and memory. I had receipts, not scandalous ones, not anything illegal or unethical, but something more powerful in a family dynamic built on narrative, accuracy. I realized that I was the common thread in many of the stories my parents told, about sacrifice, about fairness, about how things just worked out. My silence had been used to support those stories because I had never contradicted them. But the record I had, messages, timelines, first-hand involvement, told a more complete version. A version where choices had been made for me, then reframed as choices made with me. A version where my adaptability had been assumed as consent. A version where my lack of objection had been interpreted as endorsement. I didn't feel angry when I saw it. I felt sober, because once you see how a story is constructed, you also see how fragile it is. Not because it's false, but because it depends on everyone playing their assigned roles. And I no longer intended to play mine. What struck me most was how little I would need to say to change everything. Not because I had something explosive to reveal, but because the truth didn't require embellishment. It only required presence. I understood then that if I spoke, not emotionally, not defensively, not all at once, the room would have to recalibrate. Not because I would force it to, but because the version of me they relied on would no longer be available. This wasn't about exposing my parents. I wasn't interested in humiliating them the way I had been humiliated. I didn't want allies or apologies or public reckonings. I wanted accuracy. I wanted my experience to exist in the same room as everyone else's. And I wanted it to exist calmly. That night I made a decision that surprised me with how simple it felt. I would speak exactly once. Not in pieces, not over time, not through implication. Once, clearly, completely. After that, whatever happened would be based on truth, not assumption. There was no celebration in that decision, just clarity. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, noticing how still I felt. The pressure in my chest that had appeared days earlier was gone. In its place was something steadier, a sense of alignment. I wasn't preparing to win. I was preparing to stand accurately. And accuracy, I had learned, is disruptive only to narratives that depend on silence. I didn't know yet when the moment would come. I didn't plan the setting or the phrasing. I trusted that when the time arrived, I would recognize it, not by urgency, but by readiness. Because when you stop fearing the consequences of speaking, you also stop rushing. You wait. And waiting, when it's intentional, becomes its own form of power. There's a moment that comes after clarity, but before action. It's the quietest part of the process, and the most difficult. Because once you see the full picture, you can't claim ignorance anymore. Every option is visible, every consequence imaginable, and you have to choose which cost you're willing to pay. I spent several days in that space, not pacing, not spiraling, just observing my own thoughts as they moved through the possibilities. I could continue as before, say nothing, let the moment pass. The wedding was over after all. There would be fewer gatherings, fewer opportunities for public commentary. Silence would be easier now than it had ever been. That option came with familiarity, predictability, and a cost I finally knew how to name: erasure. I could speak privately, pull one parent aside, soften the edges, explain how certain moments have made me feel, ask for understanding, hope for reflection. That option came with emotional labor, with the risk of being reassured instead of heard, of being validated in tone but not in substance. And then there was the option I hadn't allowed myself to consider until now, I could speak once, calmly, in the same space where the narrative had been reinforced for years. Not to accuse, not to shame, but to correct. That option was irreversible. Once spoken, the truth couldn't be folded back into the old story. It would exist. Publicly, permanently. Not as drama, but as fact. I weighed them carefully. I thought about my parents, not as villains, but as people who had grown comfortable inside a version of events that required my silence. I thought about my sister, who had never questioned the roles she inherited. I thought about myself, about how long I had been shaping my life around being easy to live with, and I realized something essential. If I chose comfort now, I would be choosing it for everyone but myself. The decision point wasn't about courage. It was about alignment. I asked myself a simple question. Which version of me do I want to protect? The one who kept the peace, or the one who could finally trust herself? Once I framed it that way, the answer didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. I decided that when the opportunity came, when the familiar pattern surfaced again, when a comment was made that relied on my silence to land, I would speak. Not immediately, not reactively, but deliberately. I rehearsed nothing. That was important to me. I didn't want a speech. I didn't want to sound prepared. I wanted my words to be grounded in fact, not performance. I reminded myself of the boundaries. No raised voice, no accusations, no emotional appeals, just sequence, context, accuracy. If they disagreed, they could. If they were uncomfortable, they would be. That was no longer mine to manage. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. I wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I wasn't afraid of consequences. I was afraid of one thing only, going back. Going back to the version of myself who knew the truth and chose not to honor it. That fear outweighed everything else. By the time the next family gathering appeared on the calendar, a post-wedding dinner meant to relax and reconnect, I felt ready. Not tense, not braced. Ready, because the decision had already been made. The outcome was no longer the focus. Integrity was. And when integrity becomes the priority, the room you're about to enter matters less than the person you're bringing into it. After the decision was made, I didn't announce anything. That's the part people often misunderstand. They assume that once you decide to speak, you immediately change your behavior in visible ways, that there's a buildup, a shift in tone, a warning. There wasn't. On the surface, I remained exactly the same. I attended the post-wedding dinner. I greeted everyone politely. I asked questions. I listened. I smiled at the appropriate moments. If anyone had been observing closely, they might have noticed that I wasn't overfunctioning anymore. But no one was observing that closely. They never had. What changed wasn't my behavior. It was my positioning. I stopped volunteering information that wasn't requested. I stopped correcting misunderstandings preemptively. I stopped cushioning comments that weren't mine to soften. And quietly, in parallel, I made adjustments in my own life that no one else could see. I reorganized boundaries the way I reorganized systems at work, cleanly, intentionally, without commentary. I clarified what I would and would not take responsibility for. I made plans that didn't revolve around availability. I shifted my schedule so that last-minute expectations would no longer fit so easily. None of this was punitive. It was structural. The remarkable thing about moving in silence is that people rarely notice it until the effects reach them. They don't feel attacked. They just feel unsupported, confused. I saw it first in small ways. A task that would normally have defaulted to me lingered unclaimed. A message went unanswered longer than expected. A plan required someone else to step in. No one said my name, but I could feel the absence. Still, I didn't feel it, because this phase wasn't about confrontation. It was about allowing reality to redistribute itself without my intervention. I was careful not to overcorrect. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I didn't become cold. I didn't make a show of independence. That would have turned this into a performance, and I had no interest in that. Instead, I stayed consistent. And consistency, I learned, is more unsettling than defiance. My parents began to sense it, not consciously at first, just a subtle shift in how conversations flowed. Where they used to assume my agreement, they now paused, just briefly, before speaking for me. It was almost imperceptible. Almost. I let those pauses exist. At one point, my mother asked me if everything was okay. Her tone was gentle but searching. I met her eyes and said, "Yes, I'm good." And I was. Because for the first time, good didn't mean compliant. It meant aligned. I didn't owe anyone an explanation yet. The moment hadn't arrived, and forcing it would have undermined everything I had come to understand. Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs stability. So I waited. And in that waiting, consequences began to unfold. Not as punishment, but as adjustment. The family dynamics started recalibrating around the absence of my automatic participation. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but honestly, people don't panic when you move in silence. They panic when they realize too late that something they relied on is no longer there. And that realization was coming. I could feel it. The first consequences didn't look like consequences at all. They looked confused. A missed detail here, a miscommunication there. Small things that, on their own, were easy to shrug off. But taken together, they created friction, just enough to be felt. Someone forgot to confirm a reservation. A timeline slipped. A conversation ended with, "Wait, who was supposed to handle that?" And for the first time, the answer wasn't automatically me. No one accused me of stepping back. No one confronted me. Instead, there was a subtle shift in tone. Questions phrased a little more carefully, assumptions stated with less certainty. I noticed my parents beginning to double-check things they used to delegate without thinking. My mother started writing things down again. My father asked clarifying questions he never used to ask. They weren't angry. They were unsettled, because what they were experiencing wasn't resistance. It was absence. And absence forces awareness in a way confrontation rarely does. There was one evening when a family plan unraveled slightly. Nothing dramatic, just enough to be inconvenient. My sister was frustrated. My parents were flustered. And someone finally said it out loud. "Lena usually takes care of this." The room went quiet, not because of the comment, but because of what followed. Everyone looked at me, not expectantly, not accusingly, curiously, as if waiting to see whether the old reflex would kick in. I felt it, the familiar pull to step forward, to smooth, to resolve. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. The impulse was still there, but I didn't move. I met their eyes and said calmly, "I didn't realize it was my responsibility." No edge, no explanation, no apology. Just a fact. My mother blinked. My sister opened her mouth, then closed it. Someone else shifted in their seat and offered a suggestion, and the moment passed. But something had changed, because now it was visible. Now it had a shape. The unspoken reliance had been spoken, and I had declined to inherit it automatically. From that point on, the consequences accelerated, not emotionally, but practically. Things took longer. Decisions required more discussion. Roles had to be clarified instead of assumed. And with each adjustment, I felt something loosen inside me. I wasn't being punished. I wasn't being excluded. I was being repositioned. That repositioning wasn't comfortable for anyone else, but it was honest. And honesty, I had learned, often feels like a loss to people who benefited from the imbalance. My parents began reminiscing differently. Stories that once positioned me as easy or independent started to include hesitation, qualifiers, acknowledgement, however subtle, that things hadn't always been mutual. They didn't say it outright, but I heard it, and I understood that they were beginning to feel something they hadn't felt before. The cost of assuming. Still, I hadn't spoken my truth yet. Not fully, not clearly. This phase wasn't about correction, it was about context. They were feeling the absence of my silence, but they didn't yet understand why it mattered. And that understanding couldn't be rushed, because when people realize they've lost something they took for granted, their first response isn't reflection, it's panic. And panic was coming next. Panic doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It arrives disguised as concern, as sudden attentiveness, as questions that sound caring but land heavy with urgency. I noticed it in the way my parents began reaching out more often. Short calls, casual check-ins, invitations framed as afterthoughts, but delivered with unusual emphasis. We should all spend more time together. Things have felt a little off lately. You know we appreciate you, right? These weren't apologies. They were probes. They were attempts to restore balance without examining what had been unbalanced in the first place. The panic intensified when my absence could no longer be mistaken for a coincidence. When systems that had quietly depended on me continued to strain. When emotional labor that had always been invisible suddenly needed a visible owner. That was when the questions became more direct. My mother asked if she had done something wrong. My father asked if I was upset about the wedding. They were looking for a fixable moment, a misunderstanding, a single event they could address and then move past. What they didn't yet understand was that this wasn't a moment. It was a pattern, and patterns don't dissolve with reassurance. I listened carefully. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them as they speculated. I let them speak, because what people say when they're trying to regain control often reveals more than what they say when they feel secure. They framed the issue in terms of mood, stress, timing. They suggested space, or closeness, or distraction, anything that didn't require revisiting assumptions. I didn't argue. I didn't validate the framing either. I simply said, I don't think this is something that can be smoothed over. That sentence landed harder than anything else I could have said, because it removed the possibility of quick repair. After that, the tone changed. There was a subtle desperation now, an eagerness to return to what had worked before, offers of help, praise that arrived unprompted. Appreciation is expressed in broader terms than usual. You've always been so strong. We know you don't ask for much. You're the one we can count on. They were reaching for the version of me they knew how to relate to. And that was when I understood it was too late. Not in a cruel way, in a factual one. They weren't ready to hear the truth yet, but they were trying to bypass it. And if I allowed that, I would be consenting again. This wasn't about punishing them for not noticing sooner. It was about recognizing that awareness has a window. And that window closes when comfort becomes more important than clarity. I didn't escalate. I didn't withdraw. I stayed exactly where I was, calm, present, unmoved. I told them I would talk when the time was right, not because I wanted to control the moment, but because the moment had to be stable enough to hold what needed to be said. They didn't like that answer. Waiting is uncomfortable when you're afraid of what the truth might cost you, but the cost of waiting was no longer mine to carry. I had already paid for it for years. By the time they realized that the old dynamic wasn't returning, that my silence was no longer available as a cushion, they had run out of options. There was nothing left to patch, only something to face. And when the opportunity finally came, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. It was inevitable. Because truth, once invited into the room, doesn't need to be summoned. It arrives when pretense can no longer stand. The conversation happened on an ordinary afternoon. No raised voices, no dramatic setup, no audience gathered with the intention. It was just my parents and me, sitting at the same table we'd sat at countless times before. Coffee is cooling in mugs. The window opens. Normal light. That normality mattered, because what I needed to say didn't belong to a charged moment. It belonged to reality. My father started gently. He said he felt distance, that he didn't understand when it had happened, that he wanted to fix it. I let him finish. Then my mother spoke. She said she worried she had taken me for granted, that maybe, in trying to keep everything running smoothly, she had missed something important. They were close, but they were still circling the truth instead of facing it. So I spoke, not quickly, not slowly, just evenly. I told them that the issue wasn't the wedding, that it hadn't started there and wouldn't end there. I told them that for years my silence had been interpreted as agreement, and my adaptability had been treated as consent. I didn't say they were cruel. I didn't say they were malicious. I said they were comfortable. I gave examples, not as accusations, but as a sequence. I explained how decisions had been made without me and then framed as shared. How comments that sounded light had landed heavy because they rested on a long history of being spoken about rather than with. I told them about the reception. Not emotionally, precisely. I described the moment when I was humiliated publicly, not by an insult, but by an assumption. By the casual certainty that I would remain silent, that I would absorb it. And then I said the sentence that changed the room. I stopped speaking because it made things easier for everyone else. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Silence followed. Not defensive silence, reflective silence. My parents didn't interrupt. They didn't deny specifics. They didn't explain away intent. For the first time, they were listening without preparing a response. I finished by telling them this wasn't about blame. It was about recalibration, that I wasn't asking them to feel guilty, but I was no longer willing to be misrepresented for the sake of peace. When I stopped talking, I felt steady, not relieved, not drained, complete. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She nodded slowly, as if something had finally clicked into place. My father looked down at the table for a long moment before saying quietly, "I didn't realize how much we were asking of you by not asking anything at all." That was enough. I didn't push for more. I didn't seek apologies. Understanding had begun, and that was the only foundation worth building on. The confrontation didn't resolve everything, but it ended the illusion. And sometimes, that's the most honest ending there is. After the conversation, nothing returned to the way it had been. And that was the point. There were no dramatic apologies delivered in public. No sudden transformation in how my parents spoke about me to others. Change like that doesn't happen overnight, and I wasn't waiting for it. What changed immediately was internal. I no longer monitored myself for acceptability. I no longer filtered my reactions through the question of whether they would be convenient. I spoke when something mattered. I stayed quiet when it didn't, because I chose to, not because I felt obligated. That distinction reshaped everything. I noticed how differently I moved through rooms now. I didn't stand slightly behind. I didn't scan for tasks. I didn't feel responsible for managing the emotional temperature of every interaction. I allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it. And when I did speak, people listened, not because I demanded attention, but because my words were no longer diluted by constant accommodation. My relationship with my parents is still evolving. There are moments of awkwardness, occasional missteps, but there's also something new. Hesitation before assumption. Pauses where there used to be certainty. That pause is respect in its earliest form. My sister and I are different now too. Not closer in a sentimental way, but more honest. She no longer expects me to step in automatically. I no longer offer automatically. When I help, it's because I want to, and wanting feels very different from being needed. I don't resent the years I spent being quiet. I understand why I did it. Silence kept me safe when I didn't yet trust myself to withstand what speaking might cost. But I also don't romanticize it anymore. Silence isn't a virtue, it's a tool. And like any tool, it matters how and why you use it. Today I still appear calm, still composed, still easy by most external standards. But the difference is this. My ease no longer comes from erasure. It comes from alignment. I know where I end, and others begin. I know when something is mine to carry and when it isn't. I know that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you accept the limits others place on you. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity has a quiet authority to it. It doesn't demand. It doesn't chase. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply stands. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that respect often arrives after discomfort. That people don't always change because they understand you, but because the dynamic they relied on no longer works. And that's okay. You don't owe anyone the version of you that was built on silence. You owe yourself the version that can finally speak without fear of losing belonging. Because belonging that requires your disappearance isn't belonging at all. For a long time, I believed that keeping the peace was the same thing as being kind. I thought restraint was maturity, that endurance was strength, that if I stayed calm long enough, things would eventually balance themselves out. What I learned is simpler and harder. Silence doesn't disappear problems. It preserves them. It preserves dynamics that benefit some people more than others. It preserves narratives that feel stable only because no one is challenging them. And over time, it teaches everyone involved a quiet lesson about whose comfort matters most. Silence protected them. It protected my parents from having to question the roles they had grown accustomed to. It protected familiar stories from being examined too closely. It protected the idea that everything was fine, because fine had never been defined. But the truth changed the room, not because it was explosive, not because it was emotional, but because it was complete. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand accountability. I didn't ask anyone to choose sides. I simply stopped participating in a version of the story that didn't include me accurately, and that was enough. The moral of this story isn't that you should confront everyone who has ever underestimated you. It's not that family dynamics are inherently unfair or that silence is always wrong. It's this. If your silence is the reason a dynamic works, that dynamic isn't neutral. You're allowed to outgrow the role that once kept you safe. You're allowed to speak without making it dramatic. You are allowed to choose timing over urgency, clarity over chaos, truth over convenience, and you are allowed to do it once, and let that be enough. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is the thing you've never said before, delivered calmly, without asking permission. Because people don't change when you beg them to understand. They change when reality does. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in the quiet one, the reliable one, the person who's always fine, I'd really like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that your silence was holding a system together? And what happened when you finally chose to speak? Your experience matters.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.